The dive watch is the most popular category of watches, but they all look 90% the same because they have the same requirements in order to be a dive watch. But then you have a brand that approaches everything about watchmaking differently, and that's Ressence. And the Ressence Type 5 is a dive watch that's unlike any other. So let's get into it. So Ressence is relatively new to the watch scene. 2010 is when they're founded by a Benoit Mintiens. Apologize for that one immediately, but he's an industrial designer from Belgium, so he doesn't come from a watchmaking background, which means he approaches everything about watches differently. And the original watch he comes out with doesn't have any hands. It uses rotating discs that tell the time. It's a new interpretation of a watch. It looks very much what's called a regulator watch, where the hour, the seconds, and the minute are all in different planes. In this case, in different rotating discs. With the minute being a large rotating disc and everything within it rotating and also rotating around the dial. The best way to get a feel for this is to see a time-lapse video of the watch going around, where you can see the second hand whipping by, or the second disc whipping by, the hour disc slowly moving, and the minute disc going completely around the watch every hour. It's a beautiful ballet to see, and after you spend a minute or two with it, it's obvious what's going on, and it becomes pretty easy to read. But that's where they start, and then they get fancier, which is having oil-filled watches. And the Type 5 dive watch from Ressence is one of those oil-filled watches. So the question is, why fill a watch with oil? The main reason is for looks, to be honest. So since the sapphire and oil have the same refractive index, if you take a dial, fill it with oil, and then put sapphire above it, it actually looks like the dial is right on the sapphire. So when you look at a Ressence, the dial, it looks like the dial is right there up top. All the spinning discs are right there at the top. Obviously, there's the sapphire crystal there. And just below that is oil, and then the dial. It's all in a very small cavity, but the optical illusion is that it's all right there at the top. And it's a beautiful thing to see, and becomes really hard to even see where the discs churn and where everything is different. It almost looks like a digital display, but it's a mechanical display. But then there's a big problem with oil filled, which is the gears or the springs going back and forth of the hairspring. If it were to go through oil instead of air, the density of that oil would just slow down the rotation of everything and throw everything off. Watches aren't built to run in a liquid. They're built to run in air. Mr. Benoit did come up with a solution to this. And it's the fact there's basically two watches in one. The bottom half of one of these oil-filled Ressence, like the Type 5 we have here, is a mechanical watch that we're used to. It's actually a very heavily modified 2824 movement. One of the most common automatic watch movements in the world, and a very good automatic watch movement. It's one of those, it's the definition of a workhorse movement. It works well, it's easy to service, it is a nearly flawless movement, nothing to say. It's perfect. It's why it's used so often and for so long. That doesn't work in oil, so it's sitting in air below. And then up top is the dial and the gearing for all of the different sub-dials and the discs that they're on. In order for the two to communicate, instead of having pinions going through the oil or gears going through the oil, there's actually a very thin titanium membrane and then magnets on either side. So there's actually magnets inside a watch, which is usually not where you want a magnet, attaching the two different gear trains and having them move together. And it works incredibly well. And even if you try and set the watch too quickly and decouple the magnets, they actually snap right back pretty quickly if you just keep moving the disc around. It's an ingenious solution, but it also leads to the problem of what do you do about magnetism around a watch? Because normally that's an enemy that hurts the timing of a watch. And they fix this problem of magnetism by the bottom half being surrounded by a highly magnetic permeable cage, basically. So all the magnetism from the magnets flow around the movement and never reach the hairspring or the mainspring the parts of the watch that you want to keep magnets away from. It's an ingenious solution, and it's actually something that's been around for a while. The early anti-magnetic watches used that. Rolex still uses it for the Milgauss. It's a great solution, and for the teeny magnets that are in here, it works perfectly. I've never heard of anyone ever having a problem with magnetism inside this watch, and it's a watch with magnets. And if you look at the watch, there's one other disc on here besides the hour, minutes, and seconds, and it's actually a temperature gauge. The other problem is if the oil is filling the entire top of this watch and there's no bubbles or air gaps, if that oil heats up because you're out on a hot day, it can actually put pressure on the entire watch and stop things from moving. If it gets too cold, it will start to create bubbles because it will contract and you might get some bubbles and you might get pressure the other way on the watch. Ressence actually has 7 miniature bellows inside the watch that allow for oil to go in and out of them, so that there's actually a optimal temperature range between 10 and 60 degrees centigrade that this watch the oil is perfectly comfortable being in. It will fill the bellows up if it gets too warm. The bellows will expand if it gets too cold to push the oil up. So there's this optimal temperature range that the oil will sit in where it's still good. It's not just a 5-degree range. It can actually take a real temperature swing that you might deal with by going inside a cold water and then coming out on a sunny day. So that whole system with the oil, the magnets, the 2 different movements in it all put together, they call it the Resonance Orbital Convex System, or ROCs. If you see that on a Ressence, that means it includes that entire fancy system, which is a beautiful piece of engineering and requires much deeper reading if you really want to be a nerd about it and see everything that goes on there. The gears aren't even flat, they're slightly angled. It's an entire gear train that is just completely unique. That rock system, it rocks. I feel dirty saying that, but it does. It's another layer of engineering problem that is solved with another complex system within a watch that just does things differently. This takes a 2824 movement and adds, 300-400 extra parts to work just in a different way. You have to appreciate what Ressence does there. It wasn't a matter of what's the best way to do something, what's the easiest way to do something. It's what's the most unique way we can do this, where it has our own look and our own design to it, and we'll figure out all the engineering problems afterwards. And they did so really well. Again, I've never heard of anyone having a problem with the oil, magnetism. It generally, the idea, every feedback I've ever heard from someone who owns a Ressence is they're amazed at how well they actually work, considering all the problems that could arise. They've just over-engineered this piece of art on the wrist. Now, the Ressence Type 5, the dive watch version of these oil-filled watches, has to adhere to certain standards to be called a dive watch. And there's an international standard called the ISO 6425. If you want to be called a dive watch, you have to adhere to this. These standards are the reason why every dive watch looks the same. They have to have a locking crown. There is actually a slide lock on this that locks together the 2 sides that locks the gasket together. So it forces everything together, just like you would see with a locking crown on a Submariner or Seamaster. It has the same type of gasket system. It just engages it differently. It has to have a dive timing bezel, a unidirectional bezel. Has that on it too. It's just really well done into the curve of the case. So it's hard to notice at first, but it's there and it's easy to use. It's just well sculpted into the case. A dive watch has to have lume. So if you go underwater into the darker areas, you have to be able to see what's happening in the watch. This watch has lume. The entire dial is lume. This has more lume than you'll ever have to deal with. In fact, that visibility is better on this watch, because especially if you're in shallow water, there's a light reflection that can happen on a flat watch where it actually completely mirrors it underwater and you can't see anything. This, with the oil filled and the refractory index of that, it actually will always look clear, no matter what depth, no matter the sunshine. It's actually an easier to read watch underwater compared to your average dive watch. And the last thing, it has to be water resistant up to 100 meters. I know we typically hear for dive watches 200-300 meters, but honestly, unless you're a saturation diver, you're not ever going to have to worry about. And if that's the case, go find an Omega Pro Prof or an Ultra Deep, because you don't need it. In fact, as a human, you really shouldn't. You probably almost will never go below 15 meters deep, because at that point you lose neutral buoyancy and you actually start to sink. Not something you want to deal with. This is why most open water divers only go 5-10 meters deep. Deeper than that, you have to really know what you're doing. And in that case, you're not using a Ressence. You're not using a Seiko. You should be using a dive computer. And if you want to use a watch, use a serious professional level dive watch, not just a dive watch. But if you're average snorkeler, average person going on open water license, the Ressence will work great. It'll work just as well as any of those watches for diving. The last interesting thing about this watch is it has no crown. You actually have to unlock it, and then there's a ring around the back that you slowly move to set the time. The first time you do it, it feels kind of weird just because it's unusual, but honestly, the system works well. If you go too fast, you might decouple the magnets, but it's pretty easy to get it right back. You just keep going around. It's an intuitive system for being a unique system. And that's pretty impressive in itself. If this watch doesn't speak to you and you prefer the standard dive watch, the Submariner, Seamaster, the Seiko Monster, those are all great watches. But they lack a little flair. They have their own this or that, but they just look like each other. Like every dive watch looks like another dive watch. Personally, why I don't own many. I don't find them that interesting after you get one or two. They're just kind of the same. But if you want something really different, and yes, there's a price tag to go with it, but if you want something really different and you want something unique and you appreciate the level of engineering required to make something new, the Ressence Type 5 dive watch is an amazing piece of kit. Highly recommend it. If it's not this one, then any Ressence you should really take a look at. They're all amazing machines. You may look at some of the sizing of the Ressence, because they all are over 40 millimeters up to 46 millimeters on this one, and wonder if they're too big. They have no lugs practically. They sit really flat on the wrist and have a nice sculptured dome to them that makes it easy to wear. And at 46 millimeters, because of there's no lugs really to overhang, it wears closer to a 42 millimeter Speedmaster than it does a 46 millimeter Panerai. Actually a much more wearable watch than those numbers would suggest. In fact, on my wrist now, I have a rather large wrist. This could go even bigger and still look good. No matter what Ressence you see or what Ressence speaks to you, I highly recommend checking them out. They're all fantastic watches. But if you certainly want a different dive watch, check out the Type 5. Have a good one.